From Lighthouse Reports, this is Backlight. Every month, we take you behind the scenes of real-world collaborative investigations.
We're your hosts, impact producer Tessa Pang
and investigative reporter Beatriz de Silva.
Beatriz, welcome back. How was Perugia?
Perugia was great. So I just came back from a few days at the International Journalism Festival, IJF. And this is one of Europe's largest journalism conferences where hundreds of journalists and people in the industry descend onto this very picturesque Italian town with incredible food and meet up to discuss everything from AI in journalism to covering the climate crisis and just generally sharing tools and workshops and best practices in journalism. So it was a great time.
Yeah, definitely sounds like not the worst place for a conference. But I do feel bad for all the local Perugians, if that is indeed what they call themselves, who have thousands of journalists, right, overtake their town every single year.
Yeah, it's quite hectic, but I have to say that because it's free access, you do see a bunch of locals attending panels. There's actually a few days where there's Italian only panels, and I've seen quite a few times, local students walk in and sit in on the panel. So it's quite cool. And I was lucky that it was my second time there. And overall, this is the festival's 18th edition with 600 speakers and 200 sessions. So it's massive.
Yeah, that sounds huge. So why do so many people go every single year, 18 times in a row?
So this is a really popular journalism festival. It's definitely one of the biggest ones in Europe. And there's just an immense diversity in panels and speakers. And just in general, journalism conferences are not only a great place to hear about the work that your peers and colleagues are doing, but they're just a place where you can do the networking that often allows big cross-border collaborations to happen. So it's super important for journalists in general, whether you're a freelancer or working in a newsroom, and particularly for us, a place like Lighthouse, where all our investigations are collaborative. These are just, incredible places to meet people and learn from your peers. And in general, it's just a couple of few days where you leave feeling quite inspired about the people that you meet.
Yeah, sounds amazing. So unfortunately, I didn't make it this year. And so very selfishly, I asked Beatriz to take her mic and to record some interviews with some of the people who were at the conference. And I think even though, as you mentioned, Beatriz, this conference is free, there are so many other journalists that can't make it because there's other barriers to entry, how costly flights and accommodation are, but then there's also significant visa restrictions, particularly for people traveling from the global south.
Yeah, so it is a global conference, but obviously traveling to Europe, there are always barriers to entry in terms of visas if you're from the global south. I did hear of a couple of people who struggled to get them, or, there was someone I met on the bus and they just had a really short stay visa, for 4 days. So that is unfortunate. But hopefully to bring some bits of the festival to those who are interested in knowing more about it or could not make it, I took my microphone there to give you guys a bit of an inside scoop of what it's like to go to Perugia for the International Journalism Festival. And this episode, I'll just be sharing some insights and snippets of conversations and give you insider access live into this year's conference.
Yes. So in this episode, we'll feature 3 of the interviews that Beatriz did while she was there. And they kind of cover 3 of the major themes or topics that came out of the conference. So the first interview is with Andrés Lievano from Clip, which is an investigative newsroom in Latin America. And they talk about, what do truly collaborative investigations between Global North and Global South partners look like? The second interview is one I am incredibly jealous that you got to do in person, is with Enrique Lazo, who is a content creator who also works at Openly, which is the Thomson Reuters Foundation's LGBT platform. And the topic discussed is, how can journalists nail TikTok and vertical video? And the final conversation is with Mia Malan, who is the editor-in-chief at the Bhekisisa Health Center in South Africa. And Beatriz and Mia discuss how journalists can empower policymakers and affected communities with solutions. But first, Beatriz, I want to hear from you in a super quick lightning round. What were your biggest takeaways from Perugia?
Okay, this is hard. There were lots of excellent panels on this year, but one panel that comes to mind that I really enjoyed and I got to attend was one on extractive journalism practices. So this was led by Yusra El Bajir, the Africa correspondent at Sky News, and a freelance journalist, Jessie Lau, and also two journalists at CNN as equals, Laden Anushvar and Mira Sinthalingam. Basically, what I found really refreshing about this panel, it wasn't like a panel which was like, oh, here's how not to be extractive in journalism. It was just a full hour of really insightful reflections where, at one point, each reporter went around and revealed times where they felt, they didn't do their best in their reporting or they could have handled better a sensitive context or source. And it was just like quite humbling. It was like, it genuinely like offered a space for a great conversation on sharing best practices. These were all very experienced journalists, and they also shared how some of their work reporting on things like gender or conflicts with vulnerable sources has evolved over time. But beyond that, there was so much going on. There were a lot of sobering moments too, a lot of timely panels. So, like the founder of Rappler, Maria Ressa, and Patrícia Campos Melo, who's a reporter at large at the Brazilian newspaper Folha de São Paulo. They're two like very well known and brilliant reporters. They gave a timely panel on disinformation as we approach a year of a lot of election coverage. And of course, with the war in Gaza and Ukraine and the conflict in Sudan, there were a lot of important conversations as well being had on covering conflict zones. And I guess lastly, a really big theme in the conference was AI in journalism, of course. So everything from how Gen AI can be used as a tool in journalism to, disinformation, the threat of deepfakes during elections, and I'm not going to get too much into that, but it was also a big component at the festival this year. And overall, it was a really great place to hang out with our Lighthouse colleagues for a couple of days, so that was really fun.
Wow, that sounds like a really jam-packed agenda and super interesting sessions. And on top of that, we also had a few Lighthouse people on panels too, right?
Yes. So Bashar and Jack from our digital investigations team gave a workshop on reporting on shipwrecks, and I actually got to make it in, even though there was a huge line you had to get in like way ahead.
In the last year, in 2023, we worked on two big investigations relating to basically reconstructing migrant shipwrecks. One was this Crotone shipwreck, the beginning of 2023, that left around 94 people dead. And of course, last summer, a major news event was the Pilar shipwreck, where somewhere around 600 people died, which was covered quite widely. And Lighthouse Reports, along with media partners, did an investigation on this as well.
And then we had Daniel, our director. He spoke on a panel about funding and sustainability for investigative journalism.
If you're going to be a nonprofit like we are and you're going to survive, thrive, you're going to need to acknowledge risk. And a big part of that risk is that if you are completely wedded to, like, we do investigative journalism and it feeds this product, the chances that that product is going to stop being the way in which people consume in the outcomes of investigations is incredibly high. So we're trying to lose those kind of learned habits and think more creatively about this.
And Gabriel from our Suspicion Machines team was there to pick up a Sigma Award for their reporting. And he got to be on a panel and share some insights about the investigation alongside some other Sigma winners. That was really cool.
I think there's this perception of Europe as having these really generous welfare systems, at least in comparison to the US or elsewhere. But over the past decade, there's been this very punitive turn, and increasingly agencies and politics is looking to throw people off of welfare. And increasingly AI is becoming the sort of tool that's used to enable that.
And we also had Bashar and Daniel. They gave a lightning talk at the presentation of this year's European Press Prize shortlist. And so Bashar was on and he talked about how we used open source reporting and money trails in our Syrian phosphates investigation. And Daniel spoke about our work investigating AI systems in our Suspicion Machines investigation. So overall, a really busy time for our Lighthouse colleagues.
What we did was to build a newsroom with data journalists and open source investigators and the reporters from the countries where the phosphate is being exported to.
Yes, and I heard we had a really exciting moment too. So it was announced that our investigation into the Syrian women who were at risk of being forcibly returned to their abusers by Denmark was shortlisted for the European Press Prize.
For the migration journalism category, women on the run from abusers face being returned from Denmark to Syria, published by New Lines magazine, Lighthouse reports, Daraj Media from Lebanon, and Impact newsletter in France.
Basically, this investigation explored how Denmark's categorization of the area around Damascus as safe for return is disproportionately affecting women and is kind of undermining the government's commitment to gender equality. And it's a really excellent investigation. We'll link it in the show notes, but it was great to see Charlotte and the rest of the team who worked on the investigation honored for that.
Yeah, it was a big highlight.
So, Beatriz, you mentioned that this was your second time at Perugia. So how does this year compare to last year?
Right. So last year, it was my first time, so I came to Perugia super prepared. I had a list of all the panels on a Google Doc that I really wanted to go to, and I was just basically running around from venue to venue, attending all these panels. But this year, I took a different approach. Obviously, I spent a lot of time in the coffee shops around the venues, meeting a lot of great journalists, and obviously for the podcast, I got the opportunity to like sit down properly with people and just ask them a bunch of questions about their work. So thanks to the podcast.
Yeah, and you got so many good interviews. It was actually really hard to select the few pieces that you're going to be able to hear today. Otherwise, this episode would have been like 2 hours long.
Yeah, we had to cut it down. But I do want to say, before we get into it, a shout out to the IJF people, namely Francisca Chimino, who kindly recommended a quiet space for us to do these conversations, which is a no small feat in a large conference with noisy journalists everywhere. But anyways, do bear with us if the audio quality is not perfect at all times.
Cool, let's dive into it.
My name is Andrés Bermudez Lievano. I'm a journalist and editor at the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism, also known as KIP. And what we do, we're a non-profit organization that basically connects journalists together and promotes cross-border collaborative investigative projects in Latin America with journalists from Latin America media outlets.
What brings you to IJF? So you were just in a panel now, you were talking about your investigations into carbon offset. So can you speak a little bit about that, like the work that you've been doing the past couple of years?
Sure. I'm an environmental reporter at heart, and I, of course, come from Colombia, and which is one of the second most biodiverse country in the world. Latin America in general is one of the areas of the world, not just that are most biodiverse, but that have the largest amount of forest cover in the world. And therefore, for us, it's always been very important to have a robust environmental investigation line of work. And so we've been trying to, we like to tackle subjects that are underreported so as to, not rain where it's already wet. We want to be able to shine light on things that are not so obvious. And so 3 years ago or almost, we started working on looking at carbon offset projects first in Colombia and now in 7 other countries of Latin America to understand if they're working properly. And what we found is that a lot of them are not working properly. So we've been basically exposing the flaws and the wrongdoings involved in some of these offset schemes.
Yeah, I saw in your panel you said you've done like 17 investigations so far. And these carbon offset projects often implicate companies like Delta and Chevron, so that's massive. And so can you talk to me a little bit how collaborations work for you guys? Like you said, you work with so many Latin American countries. How do those collaborations work for you?
What we try to do normally is we work both on projects that we initiate and also on projects that some of our allies, media partners, we've worked, I think, with 100 media partners in Latin America. And from all sizes, very small, independent, specialized news outlets to larger, more traditional legacy outlets. So we try to always work with the people who know best the issue that we're covering. We don't work with the same club of same media outlets, but we try to find people, of course, who are interested in collaborating, because not everyone is, and that's fine as well. But journalists and media outlets that have a track record in those issues. And we also provide a lot of technological assistance, not just editorial accompaniment. We, for example, help journalists and media outlets in Latin America process huge leaks. We help them do machine learning of documents. We try to provide like technological solutions that will accelerate and facilitate investigations.
And Andrés, I wanted to ask you about how you guys try to collaborate or how you see collaborations with the Global North. I think some of the conversations that are being had here about like extractive practices and how do we like promote best practices. What has been your experience and how do you feel, those collaborations have worked for you?
I would say that we've had a very good experience with collaborations in Latin America, which is our region, of course. We've even had successful collaborations in countries like Cameroon, Nepal, India, that we have, when stories have taken us there. There was a couple of stories on especially one project on migration. But unfortunately, I have to say that collaborating for us with media outlets from the Global North, the US, Europe, has been more difficult. I don't think it's exactly what happens in collaborations is exactly what you were describing of extractive journalism, which of course exists. But I think there's still this idea among many media outlets in some parts, like if I don't know, their name right off the bat, I how can I know if I can trust them? And there's this trust gap that's very difficult to bridge. And I think that, we have to find creative ways to do that. That's one of the reasons why, when they invite us to a festival like this, I say, of course, yes, we have to be there. Because you can meet people and, you can potentially collaborate. And of course, the majority of the times it's easier to collaborate with someone who you already have seen in person.
So one of the really interesting things that Andrés brings up is like this trust gap that can happen, between Global North and Global South outlets and how that can sometimes be an issue in these collaborations. I guess this is something that we've at Lighthouse gone through in a way in some of our work.
On our War Winners newsroom, and Charlotte and the team can probably speak to this a little bit better, but I think there's definitely been a big effort to have long-term relationships set in those spaces to kind of build trust and set working norms that can kind of develop, from investigation to investigation as well.
Yes, Andrés really spoke about how, the importance of understanding how different partners work and obviously seeing all types of partners as an equal. And he gave some great advice for media outlets on how to build this trust, from his perspective and how to really kind of harness the benefits of these collaborations.
Try to understand this as an equal relationship in which we're both going to profit. Sometimes I think for large organizations, not because they're extractive in themselves, but I think they have a difficult time understanding that they can gain something in terms of information, of reporting.
Working with these bigger outlets, what do you think are best practices that these journalists should keep in mind if they want to collaborate not only with you, but with your partners who will be different sized, in different situations, different risks?
But I think the most interesting thing for collaboration is that at the beginning, you are able to, all of you involved, see what the other people in the room can help, get. So I think that, this is the person who specializes, who's located here, so he or she may find this type of information. If you try to sort of map the exact things you need, like the 10 types of information that you need, and then you start placing faces on them, it's going to be more productive because I think everyone involved in it sees what the other can do for them, instead of what you usually, of course, have in mind, which is you know what you can get and that others can benefit from. But very often we don't see what am I missing that I can't get, or that it's going to be much more difficult for me to get, but the other person in the room can actually get for me. That's the moment when a collaboration gels, because you see the value of each of the individual players.
Yeah, such an interesting interview to listen back on. I think one thing that really stuck with me was the importance of getting all the potential partners in a room and figuring out your strengths together. I think that, with how fast-paced investigations can be, it's really easy to kind of just jump straight into the deep end. And I think it's so important to have a moment to reflect on the unique skills and unique experiences that all partners bring to the table, and really have an opportunity to kind of recognize and celebrate the diversity of skills in that room. You're listening to Backlight. Lighthouse Report's monthly deep dive into the elusive world of investigative journalism. If you want to know more about our investigations, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. Or if you have suggestions on who we can talk to on this podcast, you can reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com. Okay, so on day 2 of the conference, you got to speak to Enrique, who is a content creator working at Openly. As I said before, I'm super jealous that you got to speak to him in person. How was it?
It was great. He's a great interviewee. And a big theme at the conference was talking about how journalism can cut through on social media platforms, particularly TikTok. So it was a fun interview. Enrique is a journalist and creator who works at TRF, and he actually got his first job through doing content on TikTok.
We were here at the Brufani Hotel. It's really busy and noisy, but I think we're good where we are. We're like sitting in these chairs upstairs secretly. And I basically dragged you away from your very busy schedule to talk to you about all the cool stuff you've been doing as a creator on TikTok. So if you want to start off by just tell me a bit about yourself and what you're doing here today.
Right. So I was a text journalist. I used to cover human rights in Latin America for Deutsche Welle's Spanish language service. And then the pandemic came. We were all trapped at home. I was bored. My boyfriend wanted to do yoga. I hate yoga. And my brother's girlfriend was like, there's this new app. Everyone's on it. You should join. And we started doing it together. And after a while, she got tired, but I started experimenting with videos, funny videos with music about the EU, because I specialize in my studies in EU politics, and also about LGBTQ plus rights, which is a topic that I care about personally, but also I have been covering professionally for Deutsche Welle and also as a freelancer for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And it started working out. Like, people were very interested. There was a lot of engagement in the comments, like positively and negatively. It was a time when there was like a big political confrontation between Hungary and Poland and the Commission and the Parliament around LGBTQ plus rights. So there was a lot of general public interest around that topic. And it was like my intersection, right? Like my topic, like EU and LGBTQ plus. So I started making content, and I saw that people liked it. And after a while, my former boss at Deutsche Welle, Johanna Höriger, who is also a very well-known TikTok creator, apart from being a journalist in Germany, she said, I want you to work for us. You already work for Deutsche Welle. You know how TikTok works. You're a journalist. Do you want to, join it was the first TikTok team that Deutsche Welle ever launched. I'm a very silly person, even though not everyone realizes that, but I'm a very silly person. And what I really liked about TikTok, it's a comedic aspect of it, creative and comedic. And I just liked that I could make funny videos around serious political topics, and people liked it. People kind of got the tone, and I kind of built a community there, and that's how I got my second job at Openly, which is the LGBTQ plus brand of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And a lot of what we have done on Openly, even though the content is much more serious there than it used to be when I first started my personal TikTok channel, a lot of the account revolves around the creativity of the platform.
Journalism kind of needs to evolve and experiment with different ways of presenting information. And I think it's something that at Lighthouse we're constantly thinking about. Is there a way in which we can get our findings into different formats and therefore reach and access different audiences? And secondary to that, how can we learn from these kinds of internet influencers who successfully engage with their audiences and who have so much rapport and build so much trust?
I think that there's a negative connotation around the word influencer, which comes from, I think, the lifestyle Instagram influencers that people didn't respect, especially older people.
Yeah.
And I think maybe we are at the moment in the history of the internet where we can start changing that and realize that influencers, yes, they do not have the journalistic standards that we do, but that doesn't mean that they're not important in a context of like growing mis and disinformation, with like so many challenges to democracy, and we have to engage them. Like either you have them with you or you have them against you. So my personal view is that we as journalists need to, what we want to talk about in the panel, learn from them some things, not give up on our values, but learn about how they're having so much impact on social platforms, but then also learn how to work with them and how can that work out for like different newsrooms. Like, you know, can an influencer be like a way for like an investigative newsroom to have more impact, or does it make more sense to train your own journalists to be influencers? But also, how are you still going to support that, because that takes a lot of time.
So how do you think like ultimately TikTok is changing or has changed the journalism landscape?
Mainstream festivals like this one has moved on from should we be on TikTok, but how can we succeed on TikTok, right? So that shows that, you know, that the conversation on whether we should be on platforms like TikTok is over. Like now the question is like, how do we have an impact there? Which is partly what I'm here to talk about. Either you're there or someone else is. So that's to me the pragmatic approach, right? You know, I understand that there are concerns around how algorithms work, and they're very valid, and there are big issues. It's not even my opinion, it's a fact. There are big issues across the world around how transparent these algorithms are. But I also know that from the perspective of someone who has for a while been covering topics that were not the kind of stories that make it to the cover of the newspaper, you know, take the initiative and bring your long read to your audience on TikTok, so that and make them want to read it. It's not, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, but like people are not reading anymore. People are reading. I watch TikTok and I read the newspaper every day. I just do it in different moments.
Any tips that you have for journalists who are aspiring to do work similar to what you're doing?
I would say try things out. It took me so long to figure out how to make things work on my platforms. I made so many videos that I like have deleted because I'm embarrassed of right now. And to figure out how the algorithm works, you know, why certain topics work in a certain way, or like why certain topics worked for some people but didn't work out for me. And I think the only way to figure that out is to try and fail. And when you fail, you know why it didn't work out. Try things out. Don't be scared of being cringe. You know, embrace cringe.
You know, not being afraid to be silly or experiment with different things. I think so often the topics that we cover in investigative journalism, you know, are obviously really serious and have serious implications. But I think at the same time, you know, when people are on social media or just engaging in media in general, I think people do have kind of a maximum capacity for serious news or how much serious content they can actually take on. And I think often this means that people are starting to, you know, tap out and disengage in general in more hard news. And I think as journalists, we really need to be aware of this context, and we need to learn how to better merge the two kinds of media, you know, the hard-hitting investigative findings and the kinds of lightness and silliness that, you know, Instagram Reels and TikTok content brings you. So on day 3, you spoke to Mia Malan.
Yes, so I decided to approach Mia after actually just finding her panel on the IJF website. I never heard of her organization, the Bhekisisa Health Center, and I was just intrigued about the work they're doing in the continent. And I was really, just intrigued about their work, which a lot of it is essentially about making health reporting mainstream and accessible to affected communities and policymakers. And one of the things that I learned about the work that Mia is doing that I found really great is that part of it is also about sharing skills and resources with journalists across the African continent so they can do health reporting in the way that she's doing at the Bhekisisa Health Center. And, you know, particularly, I mean, this is really relevant, obviously. And, you know, one of the things she mentions that they're focusing on now is increasing reporting on issues such as the impact of climate change on health in different, you know, non-communicable diseases. And so I just generally learned a lot. That was a really great chat.
Yeah, and I think one of the most exciting things about Bhekisisa's work is that they really look at the policy solutions to health problems. They not only try to understand, I guess, what's wrong, but also try to make really clear suggestions to policymakers about what could work in these contexts. And I think that's such a tricky line in journalism because many journalists feel uncomfortable with making policy or solution suggestions because they feel like it kind of blurs the line between journalism and advocacy. But I think Mia has a really good response to this. Let's dive into her interview.
Thank you for being here. We're at the Brufani Hotel. We found a quiet place and we're on day 3 of the festival, which is nice. It's like people are more relaxed and we're towards the end. I wanted to ask you, Mia, first just to introduce yourself and the work that you're doing at, and I want to pronounce this correctly, Bhekisisa?
That's excellent pronunciation.
Amazing. Bhekisisa Center for Health Journalism.
That's right. So I head up the Bhekisisa Center for Health Journalism, and Bhekisisa is a word in a very big South African language, our largest language, isiZulu, and it means to look at something very closely or to scrutinize it. And in a more health kind of context, if a Zulu patient goes to a doctor and wants the doctor to check them out really well, then they will ask the doctor to Bhekisisa them. So that's why we call it Bhekisisa.
What kind of investigations are you looking into recently?
So we look at health as a social justice issue. So we don't just do medical stuff. We go beyond that. So we would do gender reporting. We would look at social justice issues, for instance, water and sanitation, that has a direct impact on health, but that isn't necessarily a purely medical thing, but where we do evidence-based reporting, that means we rely heavily on journal studies for our investigations, and we specialize in solutions journalism, which is journalism that uses data to investigate whether a response to a problem or a solution to a problem works or doesn't work. So where a traditional investigative journalist, or like the world knows it out there, would go and look for documents that exposes corruption, or if a minister's wife signed a deal and got money out of it, and it's in his department, we would use data, scientific data, or evidence-based stuff to investigate if something works or not. And the reason we would investigate that solution or response is because we want to see and hold our government accountable to implement evidence-based health or social justice policies for our country.
That's really interesting, Mia. Thanks. What is an investigation you worked on in the past couple of years that has really kind of stuck?
So one of the investigations I loved it was a solutions-based story, and the solution I investigated was, in which way should we regulate sex work? The story I specifically worked on was to use data and see what happens if you criminalize a profession like sex work, or a part of society because of sexuality. For instance, if you're gay or if you're a transgender person, what happens if you make that thing illegal? And I discovered a large body of evidence that shows that if you isolate people or if you make something illegal, what you do is you don't have an impact on how many of those people there are. So if you spread disease, and the reason you spread disease in my country, specifically HIV, is because you make it so hard for that group of people to access health services. You have to go the step further, not just the data. They take that seriously. You also have to show them how it works in a country where it is legal and where it's a different policy from South Africa. So I traveled to Amsterdam. I didn't just fly there. I was at the AIDS conference there, and a case study in South Africa, her name was Nosipu, and I compared their lives. And the differences in their lives were that Elsa, because it was legal to be a sex worker in the Netherlands, had a special clinic she could go to where health workers were especially trained. No one judged her, but she was safe. There were panic buttons in the brothels where she worked, But more than that, you would walk in and there would be rules stuck against the wall, which, for instance, would say a client is not allowed to ask for drugs and alcohol, or not allowed to ask for unprotected sex. Where in South Africa, sex workers have no agency because they practice an illegal job, and if a client treats them violently, they can't go and report it to the police because they have an illegal job. And moreover, it gives the police in my country a license to abuse sex workers. And I combined all of that into a long-form narrative story. We had a budget to create lovely graphics, say, for instance, myths about sex workers or data that we used. And I could then also make these graphics available to the sex workers I interviewed, their organizations, to use in their advocacy campaigns. And often, it's not enough to just report to convince policymakers to change a policy. You often need to get them into one room to fight it out. So we also had a public discussion forum where we got very strongly opinionated sex workers along in a room with government officials, particularly our Deputy Justice Minister. Last year, South Africa announced the decriminalization policy. It's obviously not just us, it's all the sex worker advocacy and stuff as well. But our Justice Minister's opinion was changed by one of the sex workers who attended that public discussion forum. We are, of course, not an advocacy organization, we're a journalism organization, but it sometimes gets very fluid, If we advocate for something, we will not go and advocate it because we like it. It will be based on evidence. So when it comes to something like sex work, I don't care what you think of sex work. I care about the evidence. And that is what we will advocate for.
Yeah, as an impact producer, this is such music to my ears because I think the points Mia touches upon is so central to understanding how journalism can make an impact. Because firstly, to understand the impact of the story, both on the communities themselves, so in this case, sex workers, but also the policymakers, I think the construction of the story is so important. And the way in which she compares the experience of sex workers in South Africa to the Netherlands, I think is, and the strategy behind that is such a powerful consideration. But also I think understanding how your findings can actually be utilized by these communities and the effort she makes to make sure that these findings are accessible to sex workers in a way that's very directly applicable to their lives and their healths. But also I think the way in which she's then able to poise that as kind of suggestions to policymakers is, I just think that there's a really clear and tangible impact strategy here. So just a quick question. Between going to the panels, doing these interviews, and I know you were also working on our brain waste investigation that published that day, did you have any time to relax, Beatriz?
So, okay, to be honest, we did have some great downtime in the evenings with our Lighthouse colleagues. We always grabbed dinner. So that was the best time to decompress. So that was the chill time. And you can't complain because, it was in a beautiful town. And yeah, it was lovely. So just a reminder that people can go on the IJF website and watch back some of the panels that I mentioned and others online. And I guess I also want to say thank you to everyone who spoke to me for the podcast because everyone's busy and running around and there's so much people want to do whilst at Perugia. So I was really grateful.
Yes. And thanks for joining us. You can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter and Blue Sky at LH Reports. And you can always reach out to us at our email address at backlight@lighthousereports.com. And all of those accounts will be linked in the show notes.
And do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.